Here we are. We are back. This is episode 8 of ArachNerds, brought to you by Fulvius Apparel, fulviusapparel.com. Use that code THN at checkout. Get 15% off your order. That is the exclusive promo code for THN listeners and viewers like you. The mouse mugs have gone viral once again, so I've been busy this week with just a massive influx of orders on those. So those have been going out slowly but surely. And if you're a listener and you got on that bandwagon, thank you. At some point I have more stuff to add. I just haven't had time. It's been absolutely nuts here. Between that and then, laser side of the business that picked up a lot all of a sudden too. So it has been a hectic week or two on all fronts. So, but we're back. We didn't do Snakes and Stogies Monday. We were going to, and then Phil was like, let's just do Thursday because he's going to be joining us this evening. So we're doing kind of a crossover, I guess. I don't know. Do you even have a cigar tonight, Phil?
No, I was so panicked to not be late because I'm chronically late. Yeah. And literally I set my alarm for like 7:50, 7:52, like just contingency plans, right? And then all of a sudden I start getting all these pings from NESERG, and I'm like, oh, he knows. He's doing his due diligence.
Check your mic is check the connection on it. I don't think it's
my mic.
There you go. We got it. It was staticky for some reason.
Okay, we're good now.
Yep.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Cool. Excellent.
So this week, or this episode, I should say, since we're not necessarily doing a weekly, I'm really excited about. I know Phil and Sarg are both really, definitely excited about it too. This is when we started this episode, legitimately one of the first people that was on, the top of the list, as far as people I wanted to have on and talk to. Was Brandon Russell, who is joining us this evening. He owns Arachnid Rarities and Verve Biotech. So I am really anxious to get into this. I don't really have any updates. I don't know if Phil or Sarg, do you have anything pressing?
No, just got some two new bows and put them in quarantine and just waiting and biding my time for it so I could find a new apartment with larger space that could start keeping inverts in and not be paranoid about poisoning them all with my quarantine setup. But other than that, just ever checking lists. Like I was actually on Arachnid Rarities earlier today in the Loxalis and the Sicarius species. I'm like, I want those so badly because I used to keep them like in the past. But yeah, one day soon, hopefully.
Phil?
I'm no news is good news on my end. Am I still staticky or no?
No, you're solid.
Okay, good. I'm at a point now where my scorpions are at that in-between stage of looking healthy or looking like grotesque jelly beans with legs. And I'm finding myself like I'm reminding myself, don't give them another cricket. They don't need it. It's been 2 weeks. It's fine. But it's good because I'm feathering the diet, if you will. So other than that, I have no news. I figured I'd give a little arachnid tidbit of information. We're good to go.
Well, when we were planning this episode too, like when we lined it up and scheduled it and stuff, we were like, oh, we got to have Phil join us because Phil's a big arid scorpion guy and he's, big on Parabuthus and Androctonus and Leurus and everything. So we were like, hell yeah, Phil, you got to join us. Because he's like, oh, I have so many questions. And we're like, dude, just come on with us. Like,
don't say that now because I'm going to forget them all. But I truly thank everyone for allowing me to be on the show. This is super cool. And I'm just happy to be here, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, man. I know this was well requested not only by us, but also some of our listeners kind of chimed in and said they really wanted to hear Brandon talk. So it's great that we're able to get this set up and started.
Yeah, Serge's been knocking out of the park as far as the scheduling and getting things in line because I'm not that disciplined with it.
Don't say that now.
As Phil knows.
Yeah, our other shows just play it by ear, edge of your seat. Yeah. This is good. It's good to have some structure.
But so Brandon, thank you for joining us. we're sort of gonna start with the traditional podcast stuff of your how you got into inverts, what led you to creating Arachnid Rarities, and then what created Verve, sort of what you're doing there. And then I'm actually curious about your educational background, as far as schooling and stuff, because you're doing some really cool stuff, even if it's like on the academic side, in terms of I think you do some lab work and some other odds and ends. So can you give us the rundown on that?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk and share my experiences. In regard to kind of how I got into really inverts and reptiles in general is from the time that I was, a young kid. I was just always outside we had woods in the backyard, and so I'd always just be going out and going to the stream, catching stuff, whether it was turtles or snakes or any kind of bugs and things of that nature. So just an inherently curious kid that really enjoyed wildlife. And so, I think from that standpoint, that kind of spurred my interest in wanting to, keep reptiles as a pet. As a kid, had a mother that was very willing to accept that I wanted to do that. I don't think she was ever really thrilled about it, but at least provided me the opportunity, right, to bring things inside the house and keep things. And sometimes I try to hide things too, and that sometimes became problematic. And really, the only time that I can say that she was ever really upset with me about something that I was keeping that did not let her know was when I was in high school. I got my hands on a rescue alligator that was probably about 2.5 feet long, and I just took it in until I could find a better home for it, type of thing. I didn't tell her about it until she went down to the basement and saw there was an alligator in her basement. And that was I think where she drew the line.
You should have just said that. That was already there. That was there before.
Yeah. So so I've always kind of had interest in both reptiles and invertebrates. Mostly kept reptiles and deep in the reptile hobby as a kid and through high school, early into my in college. But my first kind of real experience with invertebrates and where kind of my fascination came from is when I was in 5th grade. Our family moved to San Diego, and we lived kind of on the outskirts of San Diego a little bit. So had some rural area by our house, and I was just kind of exploring, and I found a black widow. Coming from why I moved from Iowa, which there's not black widows in Iowa, and I knew right away what it was, and so of course I had to catch it and keep it. And so in 5th grade, I just started catching all these black widows and putting them in containers and just had them in the garage, and I would go catch bugs and feed them.
That's fantastic.
Which that was fine too until my mom found them in the garage.
That was too.
Yeah, he had the guts to do what we didn't,
Yeah. And so, and also another thing too with that aspect of things is I came from Iowa, where like any spider, I would catch barehanded and keep and stuff. And so that was the first time where I had to like take a pause and be like, oh, it's probably not a great idea to pick this one up with my hand, type of thing. But that not only was finding them interesting to me, but it was like, oh crap, we have a black widow problem at our house, because I was finding tons of them. And not only did find that, but then when I was at school, I was like, gosh, there's got to be some around here too. So I started finding them at school and on the playground, and they actually had to shut the playground down because I had found and caught black widows in the playground. They had to close everything down and get rid of them. So that was kind of my first, exposure to kind of the more venomous, medically significant side of things on the invertebrates. from there, I again kind of like never really kept to keep things, especially when we moved back out of California. And I just kind of dived deep into the reptile hobby. So I kept a lot of colubras, king snakes, and then king snakes, milk snakes, and then I started getting into some of the arboreal stuff. I had like amethystine pythons, green tree pythons, emerald tree boas. So that was kind of my big thing when I was in high school.
Nice.
Amazon tree boas was keeping a lot of that stuff. And then at some point, college happened, and I had probably 150 something reptiles. Had to move away to college, so had to reduce that down quite a bit, but still kept a lot of kind of like the higher end stuff that I really enjoyed and took them to college with me. And which made it interesting with my roommates. They're all my friends, so they knew, but definitely they weren't like totally thrilled about the fact that, keeping that stuff, but that is what it is.
So when did scorpions come into the picture?
Yeah, so actually scorpions really didn't really come into the picture like to start really keeping them until I kind of started Verve Biotech in 2016. So I did work with scorpions when I was an undergrad. So I went to Iowa State University, majored in microbiology. And during that time too, my oldest son was born when I was a sophomore in college, so started pretty young in that regard. But it kind of required the necessity that I had to both work and go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And so at any given time, like I would have 3 jobs while doing undergrad work. And usually one of those jobs I would have at the university that I could go and work kind of between classes and things of that nature. And so one of the jobs I had at Iowa State was at the Iowa State University Insect Zoo. And they have a wonderful program there. They do tons of educational kind of shows and things like that, or educational like shows and displays for a lot of like schools and like libraries and things like that during the summer. So my job was they paid me to take care of there's 2 or 3 of us that just took care of the whole collection. We took care of all of the roach colonies that the entomology department used for research. We had tons of different species of walking sticks and mantids. And then we had a lot of, tarantulas and scorpions and things. So, I kind of, I spent a lot of time just, all those, caring for and maintaining those collections. And we'd go and do the educational displays and things too. And then while I was there too, I worked on part of my projects was developing SOPs or standard operating procedures for the care maintenance of those there. Because you're an undergraduate student, you're working, you're going to have turnover. Right? As I was done working there, other students would come in. So kind of a way to kind of accelerate the training and looking at care and then safely handling type of thing with those. So that was kind of work there. And then honestly, when I was done with my undergraduate work, kind of had a moment of, well, I have a career I have to start, especially. So I would say almost got out of everything for probably 2 or 3 years until my oldest son was old enough to start expressing interest. So I was actually prepared to kind of like, oh, that was, part of my childhood that was really important to me, kind of molded me who I was. But I was ready just to, kind of let that go and focus on family and my career.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until kind of independently, my oldest kind of started expressing interest in reptiles, which which made me excited, obviously, because that was, a big part. I got to share kind of that experience with him.
That's got to be a fantastic feeling, like not having any reptiles, not having your kid exposed to it or exposed to bugs, and then they seek a natural, organic, curiosity of it. That's got to feel fantastic, man.
Yeah, that was nice. And I tried to, like, I guess as a parent, right? I'm very, I'm a pretty strong, like, personality, pretty passionate, and so I really try to make it a point not to deter or influence my kids in their own interest, right? Like if they want to, if they find something interesting of their own, to work hard and, like, try to invest in that interest for them.
Yeah.
So we started kind of just getting to get a few more, like a ball python here, or a gecko or a frog there. So a few small things, and I just continued to work in my career. I was working full time for a small startup company developing vaccines for swine, and then also going to graduate school at the same time for immunology. And so I built over time just a really strong background in vaccines and immunology, and during that time, I kind of felt like I wouldn't say I wasn't happy with my, like, where my career was going. I just felt like something was missing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always had this desire to kind of have, start my own company or have my own company. And that's a tough, especially in the science industry. That is a risky and often, more so failures than not to try to pursue that. It's expensive. And it's really difficult. So, I was trying to find the time, when that would make sense. And honestly, I don't think there ever really the true time that it ever makes sense until it kind of just happens, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So where my line was, where it just kind of happened, was I established my LLC, Verve Biotech, in end of 2016. And then from there, I actually created it without having an exact idea of what I really wanted to do with it. So I had some ideas, and I wanted to, I had some ideas of kind of what I wanted it to be. But it wasn't until, like, it was like my kids had a snow day, like in February, and we were just going somewhere and driving home. And so I have 3 kids. My oldest is now 19. I have 14-year-old twins, but one of the twins, we were driving. I don't even know how old he would have been, but pretty young. And he said something about black widows, like just out of the blue, which I'm like, all right, where's this conversation going? Because I like black widows. And he was something on the effect of, like, Dad, we should just get the venom out of black widows. Like something that'd be cool or something. And I was like, oh, that makes, that is such a seamless combination of really my passion with animals growing up, combined with, my career and education that I've built, is to pursue something along the lines of essentially venom used in the biotechnology field, or the scientific field in general. So that kind of was the start. And then, it's a process to kind of really figure out, like, how does that look? How is that going to work?
Mm-hmm.
While still having a family to support. I can't just, quit my job without a concrete plan and funding and that sort of thing. So I kind of just puttered around for a few years, quote unquote, being a part-time entrepreneur. And if talk to anybody that started a company before, there's no such thing as a part-time entrepreneur. You either got to do it or you don't. But that's a scary thing, right? To make that jump. So really where that jump occurred was kind of during COVID. The company I was working with, I just got to a point where I was like, this isn't working for me or anything else of that nature. And I was like, all right, it's kind of now or never. Mutually parted ways with that company. Everything was shut down, so it wasn't like it was going to be easy just to go and apply and get another job in the in the industry that I was in. So like, all right, now or never, and just hit the ground running, and really started working towards, the goal really is to, work on developing innovative treatments and diagnostic tests for people and animals that have been envenomed by both invertebrates and reptiles. So where the keeping of the invertebrates came in was the fact that I figured it was really easy if I wanted to obtain venom for research and relatively affordable for reptiles, right? So snake venom. There's quite a few suppliers for snake venom. It's not cheap, but it's not expensive at the same time. So, really from a perspective of time and resources and what it costs, it's easier for me to just purchase snake venom from somebody who supplies it.
Yeah.
Where I figured out was the kind of a niche that wasn't being filled really was that if I wanted venom from scorpions or spiders, it was really expensive, really, really expensive, and hard to get. So then I'm like, well, why don't I just do that part myself? I enjoy keeping that stuff, and I felt like that I could be able to kind of create that inventory and be able to supply myself with the venom that I wanted for research, and then potentially be able to offer it to the medical field and other places as well.
Mhm.
And really venom is just an absolute treasure trove of potential when you look at small molecules and kind of what they've which medicines that are currently approved have been derived from, and honestly the biomedical research part, although it's cool, that's really not something that I'm super fascinated about. So it's not, I think the characterization is really interesting, but my main thing that interests me is kind of the treatment and diagnostic aspect of things. How to provide, stable and affordable treatments to places that need it. But that's also tricky because a lot of places that need that treatment, right? They're usually more impoverished areas
Right.
that you typically have to have government funding in order to for those treatments, and they're in areas too where it's they're in areas where there's not always electricity or resources in order to keep it, right. So there's a lot of interest there figuring out how do you create something that's affordable, that can kind of experience harsh conditions and still work, and get to the people that it needs to get to. Unfortunately, and this is changing a little bit, but there's not a lot of money to be given to fund projects that don't return, don't have money in return,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Which is why you see a lot of pharmaceutical companies in general backing off reducing their production with anti-venom. So a bigger company, some of those bigger pharmaceutical companies, they would rather kind of invest, their money on something that's higher margins with bigger marketplaces, right? It's they want to put their money in something that's like a blue pill, right? That's gonna be a big money maker. So that's where their resources go, and not that they don't put resources towards some of that stuff. It's just not as much as it needs to in order to address the need. So slowly but surely, there's a lot of smaller groups and academic groups and even companies that have that are working on this, but there's still a lot of opportunity, a lot of gaps in what is currently being done. So it's just a matter of finding money in order to do that.
I've definitely seen that in my workplace. Some of the larger companies that did have their hand in anti-venom kind of slowly kind of back out of it, just due to like either funding or they just didn't see the returns, as you said, that they were looking for. So they were putting their money elsewhere.
Yeah. So that was kind of that was basically the start of acquiring different species. And really it's kind of people ask me like as far as like the species that I keep, and honestly, my big thing is that I'm only going to keep stuff that interests me. So from that standpoint, I never look at anything if something if something that I'm keeping isn't fascinating to me, then I don't feel like it's worth. I don't want to work with something that I don't truly like enjoy working with. So that's why I kind of inevitably I like scorpions a lot and the true spiders. So those are kind of where my focus is. But so then it was kind of like, how do you source scorpions?
And enough of them to even make it worthwhile to get what you need to get, and
right. Yeah. So there's a level of investment that has to be put into that. And I started like just, going to looking and finding people on Facebook that just kept scorpions. And then it was like, okay, I want to find some Arizona bark scorpions. So how do I do that? So I went to my wife's family lives in Arizona. So we go to Arizona and I was like, all right, I'm going to go catch some. Right. So there's my source for those. But then it became, I was like, all right, how do we get some of these other species, like some of the Lyra species, that there's a lot of scientific interest in those aside from the venom itself, but they have some components of that venom that's used for they call it kind of like tumor paint, where it's kind of has an affinity to tumor cells in the brain, and they can actually do a fluorescent tag on it and kind of look for that sort of thing. And so there's certain aspects that are interesting to that. So okay, well, how do I find those? So finally finding a small group of people that kept them, and I was like, all right, I'd like to buy some. And I was like, but I'd like to buy quite a few. But it was clear that wasn't a very easy thing to do either. And then so I was like, okay, well, I got to start small, and just started buying, broods, like just like, all right, 20 here, 30 there, and raise them up, just with the aspect of like, all right, this is a time investment, got to raise these up. But that was way more important to me to do it that way with captive bred than to just, go through and just buy a bunch of cheap wild caught stuff. And that's, and the wild caught stuff tends to be pretty prevalent. But obviously, there's inherently with animal industry in general, whether it's reptiles or invertebrates or anything else, the wild caught thing is something that I think, is overdone oftentimes. But unfortunately it's a big market that I don't think is going away anytime soon. But with my experience with working in the vaccine side of animal health industry, animal welfare is a very important part of my beliefs, and so I really try to implement that into everything that I keep as well. So that's also something that I think is something I always challenge myself with, is how do I do things better, right? If you have thousands of scorpions, how do I make sure that I'm providing, everything, as much, care and proper husbandry as I can. And so it's really important to me to continue to evolve that and maintain that as the forefront of keeping everything, in addition to just having stuff in small containers, and just using them when I have to use them type of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's always a big focus of mine as well, is that aspect, the animal welfare. I hear people all the time, well, there's bugs, right? Well, maybe, but it doesn't mean that, you have to cut corners from a husbandry standpoint. So, and I think that's an important topic too. I think in regards to the hobby, right? And I've kind of focused on what I've kind of worked on from the scientific standpoint. And I've probably some rambling on quite a bit, so I can allow for some questions.
It's
then we
good,
can kind of transition to some of the hobby aspects and kind of how those two intersect as well.
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's like great that you're actually looking at the husbandry aspect and looking at how things you could improve. A lot of people, once they get to a larger scale, they don't, at least from what I've seen on the hobby side of things, they don't really look at what they could improve husbandry wise. They look at what's easier to maintain, and that does happen to be smaller boxes. Maybe just instead of like providing some like hides, for example, just like making the small enclosure their hide in itself and things like that. But it's really refreshing to hear your take on how you're like looking for always ways to improve on that, even if they are quote unquote just bugs. I think it's definitely pretty great that like what you're doing.
Yeah, man.
I'm also like really kind of interested. So you do have like a wide variety of species or genera in general. What is your favorite scorpion wise? Let's attack it little by little.
Yeah. I get asked that quite a bit, and that is a tough one. I would say probably the Lyrus genus is kind of my favorite over time, and that's kind of an easy one to pick, I think. They're impressive. They get big. They're really kind of active and really cool defense displays, really cool hunting displays, really cool mating displays. So that's probably kind of like, kind of like the first love for something that really grabs the eye.
How do you feel about the recent taxonomic expansion or explosion of that genus?
I think it's good. And so the other thing you have to look at too, especially when you're talking about a lot of these species in Northern Africa, Central Africa, Middle East area, those species are right. There's not a lot of ability for scientists to go in there to do this, right? It's a tough environment, both naturally tough, right, and
geopolitically
tough. Yeah, geopolitically tough. Yeah. And so to me, it's really exciting to see, the arachnologist people out there going on these, trips to the field and doing the work. That's really inspiring that they go in there and put in the work to describe, because it's a pretty, there's not a lot of people doing that.
Yeah.
It's really clear when you have some of these species, like there's differences. So you start to kind of get into almost like these like complexes. So Lyrus is a good example, but Androctonus, so Androctonus crassicata, where that can be found in multiple countries, and there's definitely potential that some of them can be different species. So I focus on that a lot too. I keep a lot of these localities. I keep a lot of localities.
That's one of the
Strictly
questions
as localities, right?
was how important are localities to what you're getting in for.
Yeah. So I keep all my localities separate. And with the idea that, like, I'm just curious, from both genetically and from the venom standpoint, are they different? Right. So if you catch Androcnus australis from Egypt versus Morocco, that's a pretty big gap in range, right? So how similar are they? Even though they're the same species right now, how similar and how different are they? So that's something that I'm curious. That's some curiosity about.
Kind of would just want to get your take on it, since you do have a wide variety of like Lyris and other genera. Do you feel like that the color morphs? I know one of them was Lyris. Correct me with the pronunciation, because I never really say them out loud. But is it Herberti or?
Yeah, Hebert eye. Hebert
Yeah.
eye.
Um,
Yeah.
I've seen floating around in the hobby people labeling some. I know some of the labelings are probably wrong, but there's the yellow one. Then there's I've seen bright be advertised, but that was just from a hobbyist getting like who didn't have that many scorpions. So I wasn't sure if that was just another yellow or if it was just
Yeah.
something that they remembered. Do you think those are not just color forms for the time being, but do you think they could be elevated into species status? I'm not super familiar with like how like, for example, when it comes to tarantulas, like the Pteronoclus marinus, how they have the different color forms, but those color forms are thought to be different species. Is that similar to like what you feel like with scorpions, or especially with
Yeah. That is interesting. There's definitely, that is a good example of the typical versus yellow / bright. And I would assume the yellow / bright are, if it's they're probably the same in that regard for that particular Hebert species. The taxonomy in general is really, really tricky, right? That appearances alone, especially macro, right? So just looking at something isn't enough to be like, oh, this is a different species. And there's definitely, certain species that have a variety of color forms that are still the same species. So you have something like, I think this can be exhibited in like Parabuthus. So Parabuthus capensis, the Cape thick-tailed scorpion down in South Africa. There's like orange, there's like red, yellow, bright, which is yellow with like a orange metasoma. That at the very end, last couple segments, the metasoma is orange. And then there's even black. And those are, they're all from what can be, what's known so far as capensis. What's interesting
is that
about
split off from Velocis because of all the hybrids?
So that's totally different than Velocis. Yeah, okay. That's totally different than Velocis. They're pretty small. I would say they're pretty small Parabuthus species. But what's interesting about the black color form is that when the babies are born, they're orange. And then usually after I think like the 4th or 5th molt, as they start to kind of all of a sudden turn black. So that's an interesting example. And there's some other examples too of just over, appearances of the babies are much different than the appearances of the adults too.
That's pretty interesting, because I believe it was Dylan that I was talking to who had a brood of the Jordanesis, I believe that's the name of. I was under the impression, for one reason or another, totally wrong, that you don't get mixed colored broods, but he was telling me that in one brood he had a wide variety of color expression, ranging from black to brown to even some, like, I believe he said white or off-white individuals like that. Is that the same? Is that the same thing with that species?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things with Jordanensis, and yeah, so that's the black Death Stalker scorpion, um, and so all of the Jordanensis in the hobby currently have basically are from like a couple collected. Uh, so the person that collected them, like all of them come from just a couple of those. So you actually are, some of those white ones are actually exhibiting albinism, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
recessive, right, a recessive gene that's been popped up really due to lack of genetic diversity, and that's pretty interesting. But that species in general too does, aside from albinism, have a variety of different color variations of that blacks, like solid black to lighter tan or kind of golden tan color. Some are black with more like yellow legs. So you do get a variety, and I think that's just, the if I were to just kind of theorize, just from, the genetic diversity with some of those where, you do get some variety of kind of different color variations in some of these species.
So they're the ball python of the scorpion world, is what you're saying.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
Do you know, as far as that goes, though? I mean, in captivity with a limited gene pool like that, do you like how many generations in is it that we see genetic depression from inbreeding like that?
So that's definitely something that that's observed. And with Jordanensis, honestly, not seen a lot of that yet. And I mean, I would say, I don't know for a fact, but at least 5 or 6 generations in captivity,
Mhm.
at least, and they're still going strong as far as brood sizes and health and well-being. So, but you definitely find it with other species, where you'll get a couple of broods, and if you raise those up, and then all of a sudden your numbers kind of, you end up getting smaller, failure to thrive broods, and then they just stop breeding altogether. So I think lack of genetic diversity is a real problem in the scorpion hobby, to where a lot of times the captive bred stuff or the stuff that is captive bred is originated from just a handful of wild caught, and eventually that stuff fizzles out.
Yeah.
And I think you can lose species in the hobby, because of that. And sometimes sometimes you have access to some wild caught stuff to kind of increase the genetic diversity in your population, and other times there is no access to. So that definitely can vary, and I think species to species it also varies on how many generations at some point does that lack of genetic diversity start to affect it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, do you think that's the case with stuff like Jacksoni and other, the 2 or 3 species of Babicurus we had in the hobby for a long time? Like me and Phil talk about that fairly regularly. Like Jacksoni were one of my favorites when I was keeping this stuff, a handful of years ago, and then I sort of come back to it and no one has them. Like they're non-existent. It's wild.
Yeah. There's I think another part with the scorpion hobby is, from what I can see, I think there's a bigger turnover of people that really put a lot of time into it and have a lot of species, and then for some reason or another get burnt out or just kind of lose that passion, and it kind of fizzles out, and then they get out of stuff. And so when you have the scorpion market is so much smaller than the traditional market, right?
Mhm.
Just a fraction. So if you have a lot less people keeping them, it makes it when somebody who's pretty big and keeps out of them, it provides it's a pretty big gap, to try to fill some of that stuff. So, I think that can be kind of a reason why some of those species are more prominent. Other reasons are just laws of countries that are no longer exporting. And by and large, I think it's important for those countries to stand their ground and then stop importation, especially like flat rock scorpions or emperor scorpions, right? So all that stuff to where they were coming in by huge numbers and just usually kind of as like fillers to reptile imports. They just kind of throw in, if there's extra space, right? You're just throwing in some scorpions, right. And back in the olden days when you could like pick up emperors and dictator scorpions for $5 or flat rock scorpions, and really the access and cheap access to those animals, people just kept them, but nobody really spent a lot of time into investing in captive breeding them. So with not investing that time because of just the access, right? And even if you could captive breed them, who's going to buy the babies when they could go buy an adult for $10?
Right.
Yeah.
So these countries then were like, oh gosh, no more, because they're just pillaging the native populations, and I think that's a good thing to reduce that. But then it became the thing where like, okay, well now they're no longer coming in. So flat rock scorpions, Hatogenes troglodytes, which is like I get messages, tons of messages weekly. Like, do you have flat rocks? Do you have flat rocks? Well, I do, but keep this in perspective. The fact of, sometimes these can take 7, 8, 10 years to get to maturity, right? Yeah. Have a gestation period of 2 years, to have babies. So if you're lucky enough to get some, right? So there's such a gap between being able to raise them up, successfully produce them. And, it could be, I would say, even if you were successful keeping them, after 25 years, there's still no way that you could even come close to supplying the market demand for them.
Yeah.
Right.
For the hobby. And so, it's kind of you're in a tough spot. And so, and it takes a lot of effort to want to invest that time into a project like that too. So I keep a variety of flat rocks. But like, honestly, I don't ever see a point to where I will have an opportunity to offer them into the hobby because just of that time. And which is kind of funny too, because people get really upset at you for having certain stuff and not making them available. I guess, I get it to some degree, but the other part too is that even though I offer species to the hobby, that's not my priority. And not having that priority as well, I think, allows me to, I guess, operate just kind of differently than other typical vendors that are bring in animals and their goal is to, you got to make money in order to keep going. And so like I just offer surplus just to help subsidize my costs. But like I'm never gonna come close to drawing a profit from selling the hobby. I mean, when I do an import, I'll import a couple thousand scorpions, like captive bred scorpions. And people don't realize too, kind of like with importing and what my costs are versus like what I charge. There's a big disconnect as far as like people don't realize my costs up front for something like that. But my import fees, cargo fees, and fish and wildlife fees alone on these imports that I do cost me around like $2,500 to $3,000 out of pocket before animals.
Yeah.
And if you're doing kind of hired reptiles and stuff like that, you have a less number of reptiles to kind of make up for your margins on some of that stuff, right? It's different.
Right.
But some of these, like trying to not lose money, your margins are so much smaller, especially on scorpions. People can, I would say, you could on an import, sometimes you get some of these tarantula slings for like $2-3 a piece. Versus I have some scorpions that I import where my cost alone on that scorpion per animal maybe $50 or $60. Like there's right, so like I have this balance of like, I'm paying pretty high dollar from the get go for some of these. I have to keep back a portion of them, and then I'll sell, limited few, and I have to try to come up with a reasonable kind of resale price that that's kind of justifiable to where I'm not sitting here trying to make something as expensive as I can, but I also can't, lose. I already lose thousands of dollars when I do an import just from what I keep back and what I invest in. But I like try to lose as little thousands as I can in that regard. Yeah. So where I try to do is if it's something that's new, kind of higher demand, then it's going to be more of a premium price. But as I grow these things up too, and I produce broods of my own, that allows me right then to help bring down those prices. So where I can, I always try to try to make things as affordable as I can. But I also too have to I do have a business, and although it's not profitable, I want it to be, I have to try to make it as at least somewhat as close to break even as possible, even though that's not going to happen.
I definitely understand all that, especially coming in like fees are higher than ever now, and especially especially as you're saying, going back to your point with like wild, a lot of countries shutting down or monitoring more closely their wild caught animals, or putting quotas on there, or just shutting down things. I know in the tarantula side of things, one of the biggest ones was Gramstola rosea. I don't think like back in the day you could tell anyone the imports are going to stop and these slings are going to go up for like $40 a pop and everything. If you told someone back, like if you told someone back then, they just call you crazy. But it kind of puts in perspective, like there was hundreds of, if not like tens of thousands of these animals being brought in, and all of a sudden when importation was closed, where did they all go? And it kind of brings into perspective, at least like when I was like talking to a lot of scorpion keepers and everything, which rightfully so, that they were a bit, especially with like rare species or more common species or harder to breed species, they were being pretty selective to where they went. Which is understandable, especially since the, as you mentioned, the scorpion hobby is a lot smaller than the spider side of things, and you want to ensure that like, oh, if I'm going to be selling this mature female, it's going to go somewhere that hopefully this hobbyist could take it and run with it, and hopefully they'll be able to produce it and be successful with it, and just keep it going in the hobby. Because I know back in my arachnoboards days, I was talking to some scorpion keepers. When I was younger, I didn't keep as many scorpions because it wasn't something I was like super comfortable with at the time. Because in my head, still every scorpion was dangerous. Like in my head, Pamphovidius, thank you. But I know like Arachno Drew, for example, on arachnoboards. His name is just like, I know like when I started getting into scorpions heavy, I was buying out the last of his Parabuthus granulatus. No, not granulatus. Transvolicus. groups and everything because he was getting out of the hobby or getting out of the most other things. So it's like a lot of those like bigger names that like I was like conversing with on the forum days. I don't think many of them were, or yeah, I don't think many of them are even keeping still or like advertising they're keeping. So like I completely agree. There's like that higher turnover rate than there is with tarantulas or other inverts, which is
Yeah.
kind of depressing. um, but
Yeah.
but I get it. Some people get burnt out over it, but yeah,
It is hard, I think, especially scorpions specifically, because with the market being so small, like the volume that you're able to move, um, and the price that you can get can be really discouraging. When you spend, you could spend 4 or 5 years plus, on a project, raise these scorpions up. Like you're putting your time, your effort, and then you miraculously, get something to produce. I got these babies, now I want to sell them, and how do you reach the people that are interested in buying scorpions? Um, there's not as much, right, as the tarantula side of things, and trying to establish a customer base, or trustworthiness, um, and to get a price on them that you feel like is worth the time and effort you put into. And I think that struggle, it can be really discouraging to a lot of people, and especially, like, I see it, like, I can't tell you how many species that I have that I keep that are, like, I think are just freaking amazing. Like, they are so awesome, enjoyable to keep, and and I, like, maybe sell a couple a year, right?
Like which
And
species
so
in
it's like,
particular?
oh gosh, I think, so I like a lot of the smaller species too, which is, I think, the toughest to sell for scorpions, which is kind of ironic because people love to go out and buy, like, the teeniest, tiniest tarantula sling, right? That there's a huge market for people keeping dwarf tarantulas, but not a lot of people want to keep dwarf scorpions. And so there's quite a few species like Scorpiops, and those are from a smaller species to a bigger species. Charillus, Orthocyrus, to where they're harder. And I think just inherently the scorpions are more intimidating to keep too. So I think that's a tougher, bridge to cross for some people. Is trying to, the intimidation for caring for some of that, and that's why I think the market is smaller, because there is an aspect of, like, they do require a little more, care in regards to additional heating, and so to keep scorpions at a bigger scale requires more investment in how you're keeping them than something like tarantulas. Now, I would argue that, I get back to husbandry, that there's a lot of people that are keeping tarantulas that are surviving, not thriving. So some of the appeal to that tarantula is you could put a bookshelf in your living room and pack that thing full of enclosures with spiders in them at ambient temperature, right? And you just got to worry about, if it's arboreal, give it some more height, and some, if it's fossorial, give it some more dirt, moisture, and you feed them. And I think, yeah, that spider's growing, and over time it does grow. But I would argue that spider's mostly just surviving, not thriving. There's a big difference, in my opinion. And ironically, I think ironically is that can be a controversial opinion. I think there's some pretty prominent, tarantula keepers that really push that narrative of, they don't need this, they don't need that, they don't actually need this. And honestly, from my perspective, I don't necessarily need sunlight, but I sure as heck enjoy going out in the sun every once in a while, right? It's like, I could survive without sunlight, going outside, but gosh, I sure feel better when I do. And I think there's an element of that with invertebrates that yeah, they're surviving, but if you have certain tarantula species and you give them the option, right, to go from room temperature to a 90-degree hotspot, that tarantula will go to that 90-degree hotspot and just hang out. And it prefers that. So giving options, I think, is an important thing to do. But again, that can be really difficult at a large scale. And that goes back to, for me, where I focus on, trying to improve my husbandry practices. And again, I'm always trying something different, always trying to look for ways to improve. But I do think with scorpions that they do need a little more extra for that husbandry aspect. That's kind of a deterrent for people to keep them.
I definitely really like the point that you made about surviving versus thriving. I think we actually conversed on a thread a bit on the Scorpion Hobby Facebook group, because when I first got in the hobby, I was buying from Gordon, I believe his name was Gordon Riley.
Yeah.
And I was really just like picking his brain to the point where I'm pretty sure I was being annoying about like, hey, how do you keep these species? I want to make sure things are right, to the point where he actually took us like a short video on photos about the DIY kind of heated cabinet he made for his species. And although I was just in college, I was kind of too broke to do that, nor did I want like to have friends over and them just look at it like, what the hell is this in your room. I went out and bought some like styrofoam, long bigger pieces of styrofoam, created a box with ultra therm heat pads on each side, controlled by thermostats, and kind of made it so all my arid species were around that. Because I was talking to him, I believe, with a lot of Lyris and Parabuthus species, keeping the young instars at like 85 degrees, and then the adults at a bit higher, reaching a max of 90 degrees, I believe. And then even with my tropical species, just bumping it up to like 75 degrees, and just so they didn't really feel the constant swing of temperatures in my room, ranging in the winter and everything. And I thought I got great results from like you saw better molting, you saw better feeding, like the constantly feeding. And then you would hear about like on arachnid boards, people saying, why is my Lyris or Parabuthus acting all sluggish? It's eating, it's not really doing much other than that. And I just didn't have the same kind of experience when keeping them at that side temperature. And it's like the reptiles, we keep them one way, but why don't we keep the inverts like that way? Why is there this double standard? Is it because they're not equivalent in our eyes?
I think they're a step down from reptiles in terms of how we think, what they, like the mental capacity as far as that goes. Like, it's a spider, and I see both sides of it, I guess, because when you look at stuff like a lividus, that's just gonna make its hole in the corner, and then you're never gonna see it. It's there's a lot of parallels to that, and like a lot of snakes in particular. Like I'm not gonna keep a blood python the same way I'm gonna keep a coach whip. But you just got to do what works for that species, sort of what the recipe calls for, in a sense. But I am curious, like with those arid species like that are experiencing huge temperature swings from daytime highs to nighttime lows, like how do you go about, like what's your how are you keeping your arid stuff, and sort of where do you see people falling short as far as care goes, and what needs to be done better in your opinion?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. if you're looking just to keep a species, I think there's some ideal kind of temperature ranges that you can kind of maintain, um, like over time and have it, have grow fine. I think it gets a little bit different when you look at potentially trying to breed a species.
Mhm.
And I would say that is a pretty good parallel to the reptile world, right? If you're gonna breed colubrids, like you don't just keep them how you keep them all year round and just throw them together in spring and stuff happens, right? They have to go through a cool down, and and I think to some degree, scorpions are very very similar in that manner. And certain species can be pretty tricky to breed. I think for those reasons of there's environmental triggers um, that are necessary for that successful reproduction to happen. And I also think that's important too in raising some of the babies. Um, we often think of an arid species um, of scorpion, just right. You see pictures of just desert, right? And it's hot in the day, it can be cool in the evening, and sometimes cold in the evening, and very kind of caustic environment. Um, but deserts have seasons too,
Mhm.
and there's also a monsoon season, right, where there's a short period of time where there's high rainfall. Um, and coincidentally, that's typically when baby scorpions are born,
Mhm.
is during that brief wet season, um, and which is why you can't keep a newborn baby scorpion up until juvenile state. Some of those arid species require a little bit of extra moisture. Most do. Those first couple of molts, um, because they're the way their body is structured and everything. They can't retain the moisture like an adult can. So they can desiccate pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And again, those they're born in the rainy season and they have a short period of time to get to kind of that more bulletproof fourth instar, fifth instar size before the rain slows down. Um, and so you'll see a kind of a quick growth to that juvenile stage if you supply the right conditions and food supply. And then sometimes it can be as you get to that subadult stage, sometimes it can be a year or 2 years before that adult or molt to maturity, from that subadult to adult, um, which that can be frustrating if you got a female scorpion that you have a mature male ready and she takes 2 years to molt, because there's some kind of environmental trigger that she's waiting for, because there's an optimal time, and you do see like so gosh, on Sunday when I was feeding my Parabuthus villosus, every single one that was in pre-molt over a 2-day period from juveniles to subadults molted in a 2-day period, just the villosus, right? And they're not even in the same area of the room,
Mhm.
but every single one of them, you get these certain triggers that something's happening environmentally. So as far as like how I keep them, or how I keep them in general for my arid species, um, I actually right. So I have kind of a temperature controlled room, but I allow for a very seasonal um, change. So during the winter months, my arid scorpion room maybe gets to 85 here and there, but most of the time it's like low 70s at night into high 70s, low 80s during the day. And then as spring rolls in, it starts to warm up a little bit. In the summertime, it can get as high as 90, 95 in that room, for just as a high, right? It's not staying that way at night, but there's definitely times, um, so I just kind of allow that room to fluctuate as the weather fluctuates. I live in Nebraska, so we don't have the best weather. It was -10, I think, last week, and it was 55 this week. So there's an element to that. But where I do think there's a benefit environmentally is that seasonal change, I think, allows me to be more successful when breeding scorpions than maybe somebody who's in LA when it's just, mild and sunny all year round. We have some pretty severe thunderstorms a lot of times during the spring and summer. And although, severe thunderstorms in Nebraska means, tornadoes sometimes, so not like the most fun thing to like have, coming through. In fact, we had a few tornadoes touch down in my city that I live in just the last spring. But anytime we have thunderstorms, I know I'm going to walk into the scorpion room and there's going to be babies. So there's, again, environmental triggers. Yep, there's stuff that's triggering.
Yeah.
Are you misting more or adding more microclimate seasonally to induce courtship or anything like that?
Yeah.
Like something as simple as flipping the rock over, spraying it, and putting it down more often than you normally would, or no?
Yeah, definitely, especially for like pairing up females, trying to, again, the thunderstorms are great for triggering babies, but I definitely add an additional level of moisture to their kind of enclosure to help kind of promote that monsoon type season and try to feed them really well. So it does vary too, depending on the species. And honestly, there's species I'm still trying to figure out. And anytime I do figure out a species, it's pretty exciting because then it's like, all right, can I duplicate it with the same type of thing? So, breeding scorpions is definitely, I think, harder than what people think or realize. But if given, right conditions, it's you can be pretty successful at it.
Yeah,
Do you have separate? So, like with your arid stuff, are you keeping that in the same room as what you're keeping like your South American stuff in? Like, how do you balance those out?
Somewhat. Like I'll keep some stuff in, and I can kind of so I actually the building that I rent, my facility, is like an old bank that was built in the early 1900s. So it's kind of a cool building. But there's an actual vault in this bank that's probably 15-foot ceilings, all concrete, and probably about close to 100 square feet.
Wow.
And so that's where I can actually. So even when it's on the hot days where it's maybe 95, on the bottom shelves it might be 85. So even within that room, it allows for me to do a vertical temperature gradient, in addition to, just the extra provided, temperature control. So it does kind of depend on, I have other parts of the facility too. They'll use some more like tropical stuff. Like all my Southwest United States native stuff right now is like in a different area, kind of cooling. That'll start to bring those out into the other room to start warming them up and start feeding them up and pairing them up as well. So,
two quick things. First, bank vault filled with scorpion sounds badass and amazing. Two, just out of my own curiosity and just for fun, you mentioned you paired with this velocis. Do you like the typical color form better, or the orange, or how do you pronounce it? Oran? I've heard it.
It's orange, but it's, even though it is orange, it's named after the Orange River.
Yeah, that's what I.
I don't know how to pronounce. I mean, right? I mean, be honest. Like, I don't know how you actually pronounce that. And I know too. It can be kind of nerve-wracking trying to pronounce like species names. But I mean, like, being in the scientific field all my life and stuff, you read Latin scientific names all the time. but trying to pronounce them, like, I don't know, people get caught up in pronunciation. Like, just say how you think it is, and like, no one.
Is it
There may be a right or wrong number, but a right or wrong way. But I mean, like, and sometimes people that will criticize someone else for saying it, like, okay, we go ahead and say it then. Like, where do you think, where's your correct, source for correctly saying stuff?
Right.
I've had a couple of labs that I worked in because back when I was still in the wildlife field, some professors would be like, as long as you don't butcher it to where you're adding in extra word like letters and everything, you're fine. Other ones where no, look, the way you're pronouncing it is sacrilegious. You need to do it justice. And I've just come to the conclusion it's as long as you try, and again, you're not like adding a bunch of extra letters into it, you're fine. Anybody that comes after you just needs to calm down. It's not that serious. We're all just keeping
what you mean,
yeah. I mean, I look at stuff and again, like I'm very well read in scientific journals and research papers and stuff like that, and like I'll say stuff out loud to myself. I'm like, all right, sure, like just gonna go with it. So it's not, it's not a big deal. Like, get over it if you have a problem with pronunciation
real well, and then we'll talk about some of these papers that get released on some of the podcasts and stuff. And it sounds like I barely know how to read usually when I'm reading.
And I went down a rabbit hole a few years back of classical Latin pronunciations, and I'm watching all these lectures and reading every bit of Latin vernacular, for lack of a better synonym, that I could. And then you figure out how it's supposed to be, like, finger quote for those listeners, how it's supposed to be said, and you still sound like a moron. And the people that you're saying it to, they're like, oh, look at this smug asshole. You know what I mean? So it's irrelevant, right?
Yeah. So when I was in undergrad, I actually took a semester of Latin as an elective. Can we curse in this thing? I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm sitting in class for a couple of weeks, and then like I walked up to my professor. He really unique person, which I guess you have to be in order to be teaching Latin. And he was like, "So, like, what do you do?" I'm like, "I'm just, in the microbiology program, and just thought, I was just interested in trying to learn some Latin, just get more familiar with it." He was like, "So you are taking this as an elective?" And I was like, "Yeah." Just he looks at me and goes, "What the fuck is wrong with you? Like, why would you subject yourself to that?" That was kind of the.
I love taxonomy, man.
Yeah, I did enjoy that class, and if you know anything about Latin, the order of the words doesn't really matter. You can put, as long as you have the appropriate words creating the sentence, then you just put them in whatever order you want, and it's the same thing. So that it's definitely an interesting, interesting language, both from a reading and speaking perspective.
Super cool. So, what was the first species of scorpion that you intentionally bred?
The first species that I intentionally bred would have been Lyrus Hebraeus. I can't even say it. Hebraeus bright.
Nice.
And I got a pair from Arachnid, and later he told me he sold me that pair because he didn't think they were ever going to produce, and that he kind of gave up on it, and I got him to pair, and again I think environmental conditions were right, and I got a brood of those. So that was kind of the start.
Did you get to witness the courtship or no?
Yeah, yep. So I tracked everything.
Awesome.
So
did they do
anything
the
that I
fully stand-up tail thing, the tail crossing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. So cool.
Yeah. So I, put the anything that I put together, and I always document, successful pairing, and then try to keep track of environmental conditions, and then when they have babies. So I keep track of all that stuff with my labeling and documentation. just that way, if I am successful with the species, can I repeat it with kind of a similar conditions, or was I just lucky? I think there's been a few times where I've just been lucky. And I think there's a few times where, I can consistently see, okay, this time of the year is a good time to pair with these conditions, that sort of thing. So, really, so another thing with that is, like, some of these things take years, right, to truly figure out. And so I think that also can be a discouraging thing too, when you're putting time in and you're not successful, and you have to try something else. And luckily, I have the volume, right, the numbers, in order to try different things with different ones to see if it'll work or if it doesn't. So I try to share that, as much of that information as I can, to people who ask. I definitely, I'm not one for secret keeping. If I am successful with the species, I'm not like, I'm not going to tell anybody. So that way I'm the only one that, produces them. I'm more than happy to share, what I think it could be successful for people who inquire. And that's another big part. Again, like, I have a business that sells arachnids to the hobby. I also provide arachnids to school, education. Like, if I have a teacher that reaches out and it's like, hey, I'd like to get a scorpion for the classroom, a lot of times, as long as I can, I will donate those. So anytime that I can, from an educational standpoint, as long as I financially can, I try to donate as much as I can to schools, to zoos, other places. So that's an important aspect for me. So, so that being said, the big drive for me with being involved in the hobby is my opportunity to help educate. So that's more important to me than just selling a scorpion. Is all right. Like, you're buying the scorpion. Like, we want to make sure that this is right. And occasionally too, like, somebody will make a purchase, they get it, and they'll contact me a month later and be like, hey, like, it died. What happened? And for me, I'm like, all right, let's figure out. Like, I'm not a sell it and ignore it type person. I spend a lot of time talking to people. I spend a lot of time messaging people that don't buy anything from me, just asking questions, or asking questions about something they bought somewhere else. And I have no problem sharing, information in that regard. And I've had people that have, lost stuff, and I'm like, all right, let's try again. And sometimes I'll give them a discount on another one, or do something, that's not, so they have to pay full price and
try to take care of them best you can.
Yeah, I try to take care of my customers, and ultimately, so with that, right, I'm like, all right, but first we got to figure out what went wrong and how we're going to do it right.
Yeah.
So talk through everything, and as long as I'm confident that they've kind of figured out what they may have done wrong, they're going to correct. Then I try to take care of them on, getting them something, at a reduced rate, or reduced shipping rate or something like that, just that way they can be successful. Because that's way more important to me than just selling an animal. I want the education and the success for keeping them to be there.
What's the typical gestation on the arid stuff?
3 months to 18 months.
Oh, good Lord.
Could you give us an example of each?
Yeah. As far as species,
sure.
Or
What's a species that does 3 month gestation, and what's a species that's an 18 month gestation?
Pretty much any of them.
Oh, all right.
So, yeah, no, it's so here's the deal with gestation, that can be somewhat maddening. I mean, we all know for the most part that, right, you get Asian forest scorpion in that's been wild caught and it's been paired, and you could have babies like 2 years later.
Yeah.
Because that animals retain the sperm, right?
Right.
So even though we see, courtship and pairing, I think the actual development from insemination of that sperm into the egg and being born in almost all arid scorpion species, I don't want to say all, a majority of ones that, Hottentota and Arachnid Rarities, I would say probably takes about 2.5 months from insemination to babies being born. But females will retain that sperm until the environmental conditions are correct.
Yeah, optimal conditions.
To start that process.
Yeah.
So that's where you get this, where if you have them in a situation to where there's an environmental trigger that they're like, okay, we're good to go, 3 months. 3 months, you got babies. Versus if things aren't quite right, she's going to wait. And sometimes that means the next season.
Yeah.
Right. So 12 plus months later, then she decides.
Yeah.
So oftentimes, I think, that's where I think there's almost like a false perception that, like, well, they're just pregnant for a year. And I don't think that's for some of those arid species. Now I don't, and then again, that's mostly just a theory from observations and kind of what I've documented.
Makes
Sure.
sense.
We're not speaking in definitives here. We're just having a conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Just from my experiences, what I don't know is for some of the like Asian forest scorpions or the Pandanus or Pandanus family, how that works for those. So I have Gigantometra swammerdami, the huge species, and that's one that I don't think will ever meet market demand for babies produced of those, and rightfully so. They are just the most impressive and awesome species, I think, for just sheer size and stature. But those will produce a brood every 2 years. So you have a brood, you can pair them, and then 2 years later you get another brood. And I think that that's the case of, and it's almost like they kind of take a season off type of thing.
Yeah.
But they'll retain, so I pair them up, breed them as soon as they have babies, and they come off the back, and after a few months, separate the babies from the mom, and still kind of keep them communally. You pair a male up with her, and then it's another 2 years. So
wow.
That's two, like I just had 2 broods this past end of 2024, and pretty much within like 2 weeks I sold out of everything that I offered, and I've let go of a few here and there, and I had somebody come back and was like, oh, when are you gonna have more to like sell? And I'm like, maybe next year sometime.
2027.
Like,
The next Olympics.
Yeah.
Luckily I have a big enough group where I'll have broods every year just because they're offset.
Sure.
But still, it's like that's the other thing is like people are like, oh, you have a lot of stuff that's out of stock, and I'm like, well, it's all stuff that I have, but it's like some of these species, like if I have them, all the ones I sell, like I can sell them in 2 weeks, and then I can just create more.
Right.
So, and I'm not like, I'll buy some, kind of wholesale from friends that are produced. And then other than what I produce, what I have friends that produce that I will buy, broods from. My only other source is importing captive bred stuff from Europe. and so it's I don't try to sit here and just keep stuff restocked just to have it restock. I only have stuff available that that kind of fits in those buckets of, is it line up with me getting an import. Usually that's because there's new species that I don't have that I want to get, and anything also too, and I do occasionally buy wild caught stuff. I buy wild caught stuff with the intent on establishing it in my facility. So I never ever buy wild caught just to have it offered for sale. I'll bring in wild caught, and and if I let go anything wild caught, it's basically, okay, I brought in this number, I need this for myself to establish it. If I have any extras, and I've correctly been able to ID them, correctly ID, and they're overall healthy and feeding and thriving, then I will occasionally offer some wild caught, but that might be 2% of, not even that, maybe, of what I actually offer or sell. So yeah, from that perspective, it's I think there's a place for wild caught, just not at the capacity that's typically done.
Right.
To kind of go off of your point with properly IDing, which is, I greatly respect that, because there's a lot of, as we kind of talked about before the show started, there's a lot of misidentified scorpions out there. How many? And I also like how you said you're like, keep your lines pure and everything. How many scorpions species do you that are out there that are sold commonly, or just out there in general, are hybrids due to misidentification? I in my
How
head,
many
I
of them
don't
are heterometrous?
in my head, similar to how, like, how you said, like, not all of them can be easy to breed. So like, so in my head, I don't think there's a ton, but also I'm sure that there's hybrids out there that we just don't know about. People just breeding. But what's your take?
Yeah, I think the hybrid thing is pretty difficult to do. Just from, even in the same genus, even Androctonus. If you look at Androctonus and certain Androctonus that might visually look pretty similar to each other, I do observe different courtship behavior between them. So I think there's an element of potentially that there's some preventative measures and courtship behavior that would kind of discourage hybridization. Now, has it happened? Probably, and I think I've seen some evidence of in different countries where they've hybridized certain Androctonus species, for example. But I don't think it's like a easy or common thing to do. With the forest scorpions, I don't think there's a lot of people just outrightly breeding, like captive breeding forest scorpions. A lot of it's just, they have pregnant females come in, they have babies, and then 2 years later they can have babies from the same, without additional male. Where I think the problem with a lot of that is that when these animals are imported, they're imported under a species name, and that's not always correct, right? So the people that are collecting those animals, throwing them in a bag, right, putting them in a box, and shipping them over. Again, a lot of the wild-caught invertebrates are coming in, on reptile imports. I really don't think there's some level of like people that will bring in wild-caught imports of just invertebrates, but majority of things are coming in with reptiles.
Yeah.
And so let's say you get a bunch of a shipment from shipment from Africa that's got a bunch of quote unquote so emperor scorpions are CITES. So it might say like red clawed scorpion or cave scorpion or something, something along those lines. And they'll come in And I was doing this for a little while to where when I would see wild caught dictator scorpions or emperor scorpions or cave clawed, is that I would actually just like buy a few of each from that retailer, that reptile wholesaler, and strictly for the curiosity of what I was actually going to get. And then once I get it, I can identify it. In twofold, out of my own curiosity, I was curious like what actually was coming in on these days, but also too, it allowed me that if somebody was like, oh, like I just saw this for sale, I'm like, okay, well, it probably came in with this group, it's probably going to be this. So it actually could allow to help people that, but a lot of stuff ends up in pet stores too.
Yeah.
So like there's one going around now called the like Congo emperor scorpion, and it's Pandapalpus viatoris. That's the species that it is, right? And so, but they're always going to look for this like marketing edge, right?
Yeah,
sure. Try like, oh, we got to tie emperor to it somehow, right? It's related, so emperor scorpion's a selling point. We got to tie it to.
It's on the same continent.
So yeah, because and that'll go back to when I said that like I have certain species that just don't sell. I would say I keep a bunch of different species of Lyrus, right? The Death Stalkers. The one that I can sell the most of anytime is just Lyrus quinquestriatus. That's what everybody wants. You'd be like, oh, like I have this other one. It gets bigger. It's more colorful. It's way more awesome. No one cares. Like they just want the Death
fools,
Stalker.
Man. They're fools.
They just want the Death Stalker. So it's like that, and then the Black Death Stalker, Jordanensis. Like those are the kind of premium ones. But
what's the species you were talking about that gets bigger?
Well, most of those Lyrus will get bigger than Quinquestriatus. Heberti gets pretty big. Jordanensis is big and impressive. So it's kind of funny from that perspective. It's like,
sure,
people want, right, even with Androchnus, everyone wants Androchnus bicolor. It's like, that's, you got Androchnus bicolor. Like, there's all these other really cool ones, but it's that kind of like, it's that brand recognition, right?
Of course.
So you go to a store and you're like, oh, Nike shoes. Well, like, this probably aren't as good as some of the other shoes, but they're Nike, or whatever. It's kind of the same thing. It's just brand recognition.
Yeah,
where that's been what's been available for so long, and that's like what people are drawn to.
I do know whenever there's like a massive import, without fail, on the Scorpion Hobby group and some other Scorpion groups on Facebook, there's like, look at this Emperor Scorpion I just bought. And then the IDs come, that's not an Emperor Scorpion, and the other, and they get all surprised or like butthurt or defensive even, which always makes me kind of confused. It's like, why would you come for an ID help and they get defensive when you're told that it's not the species you bought it as?
Yeah,
but that's what comes with the hobby, I guess.
I have to say, I have a massive appreciation for all the Centroroides and Titius species you have and work with and put out there, because I love Centroroides. That's easily one of my favorite genre. And then the more Titius I see, the more I crave them. So.
Yeah, those are definitely some of my favorites, especially on the the tropical humidity side of things. So and again, like when you see species that I have, again, the more than likely it's just because that's what I truly enjoy. So if I don't have it, then there's a good chance that it's just not something that really interests me. But I have to be excited to be able to go in at 5 o'clock on Saturday morning, on what would normally be people's days off, to go and just feed scorpions for 4 hours while my kids are sleeping right before I can spend quality time with family. So, if I can't wake up at 5 a.m. and be excited to go, feed a bunch of scorpions, then that passion's go on. So I really focus on stuff that I truly enjoy. And it's evident too when I have to kind of make decisions on, it's great to try to maintain a couple hundred species of invertebrates. But there are times where I have to go, okay, like I have to make decisions, to cut back on a few species, just from, resources and time allowed to care for them. That's why I don't have tarantulas anymore. So I can't say any of the scorpions have ever missed the cut, but
Nice.
the tarantulas, and I kept tarantulas for a while, and I started keeping tarantulas, certain species I liked, and then it got to the point of almost like an expectation of, you have an online store, for invertebrates. You have to offer tarantulas for sale, and help kind of draw. I was hoping to draw in a bigger customer base. And what I found out was I could have, tarantulas that were twice the size for half the price than a lot of these other bigger name tarantula people. And, I would sell one tarantula every 3 months.
Wow.
So it's definitely, I've, kind of pigeonholed myself, if you will, as the scorpion and spider person. But from that standpoint, after kind of reflecting on that aspect of things, I'm that's not a bad thing.
Not at all.
I think everybody's kind of got their, I think every successful invertebrate online, store or vendor has their niche of some kind. And you kind of have to, right? I mean, if you look at all the people that have, that are vendors or online stores for tarantulas, they're all selling the same tarantulas, right? There's not a lot of variety in species. Some have more species than others, but
right.
There's not a lot of, truly variety. And honestly, there's a lot of vendors too, right? All their tarantulas are from the same source, if you will.
Yeah.
So there's not as many, right? If they're getting imports in, those are all coming from very few suppliers that are being distributed. And so that can be somewhat difficult when you're trying to make a name for yourself, competing with a bunch of other people trying to make a name for themselves, selling the same species from the same source that you bought for the same price, right? How do you differentiate yourself?
And it's kind of funny when you see multiple people selling the same thing and they're all the same size and they're all it's all at the same time.
You could definitely tell when a big import comes in, everybody has it. But I will say that when I think of scorpions, people selling and breeding scorpions, you're pretty much at the pinnacle right over there for the scorpion hobby. I think that there's some people right now they're at the top for the tarantula one, and then you're the scorpion one. I think there just needs to be someone who's on top of the centipede one. But that's its own kind of thing from what I've heard. Because I saw that you'll carry some species every so often. I'll check in because in my head, if I buy them, similar to how you were talking, I have to really like them, which is why I don't think I'll keep Poecilotheria. And I want to breed them. However, I can't. I don't know how to go about that for centipedes, and I don't think not everybody has it down. And also the macrophagy kind of scares me a bit because I don't want to raise something up for so long and that to happen.
That's interesting. So I do really like centipedes. And there's a couple of things with the centipedes that that kind of give me pause for really going deep into them. It's that most of them are wild caught, right? I think the availability of captive bred plings are increasing, thankfully. But for the most part, like if you want to get into centipedes and some of the unique species, like they're wild caught and they're not cheap. So the investment is pretty high to try to, get into some of these centipedes. So I have the struggle on if I want to go deep into centipedes, that it's a pretty hefty investment from a monetary standpoint. And if I get a bunch, then I have to keep back some, because I'm not going to keep something unless I have intentions from the research standpoint, on that it has value, from the venom characterization, right? So I have to keep back a certain number, and even at wholesale prices, um, they can be fairly difficult to move at, if I buy wholesale and I, go to sell at a retail price, the number of people, right, paying, $500, $600, $700 for a centipede is even smaller than the people that are keeping scorpions.
Yeah.
So if you have a bunch of people that come in, right, and some of these are like, really cool centipedes, and if you have a bunch of these high dollar centipedes come in, and you have other retailers that are acquiring those and turning around and selling, I honestly don't have a whole lot of interest in trying to compete with them,
Right.
on their customers to sell a centipede, or some other things like I keep some species of scorpions that I don't even really advertise as available. I may have them as in stock on my website, but I don't go out of my way to try to advertise if I know there are a few other vendors or friends that are also selling them. I would rather I'd rather them be successful in moving some of that stuff. If it's something where I don't feel like I have to sell any at the moment, or something along those lines, because it does kind of ebb and flow, right? You have these, like you said, when an import comes in, like stuff's hot, right? And you have this big flux of inventory. I think a lot of times if you're if you're willing to just to hold on to those things for 6 months, put some size onto them, all of a sudden what's out there, being sold is going to be, not available in other places. And then, you have an opportunity to, if you're looking to sell them, to offer them when there's still a demand, yet the supply is lower.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot of times with imports, especially with like, Androchnus bicolor and Lyra's conquestratus wild caught stuff. There's only a period of a few months where all that stuff comes in the masses. And if you just hold on to that stuff for 6 months, then you start getting people going, hey, like, why aren't these available anymore? Then you can, have them and still, and then you could, from a price standpoint, you're not trying to compete with people selling them for pennies on the dollar, because there's so many out right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely a level of economics and marketing in the invertebrate hobby.
To kind of go off of one of your points about making, well, you mentioned wild caught, and I know a lot of my friends, as Justin and Phil could kind of attest. I am a freak when it comes to biosecurity. When it comes to my snakes, I feel like right now in my room I have about like 40 boxes of gloves that I routinely like. I have 5 different kinds of cleaners that I use in my reptiles and everything. I routinely like test my animals. I know when I kept tarantulas, whenever I got wild caught, which was mainly just the Phonopelma, because unfortunately for me, my patience for slow growing tarantulas is very thin, and I would rather work with a juvenile than or have a sexed individual than other than like raising one up. Or I never just buy one; I always have multiple just to increase my odds. But I know with the wild caught Phonopelmas, a Phonopelma that I kept, I at the minimum I would wait for them to molt once before moving them into my permanent kind of collection. I know that the big issue that I was really paranoid about, even though as small it is nematodes being transferred over, as well as I know Tom Patterson has posted multiple instances where he had some species of fly, kind of like pupate out of the abdomen of tarantulas and everything. And I know that's a big thing that I'm always worried about when it comes to wild caught. I know quarantining inverts isn't really a thing as much in the hobby, but I do it anyways. But I was wondering, for scorpions, do you do anything differently with the wildcat ones? Do you keep them away from your larger collection? And is there a certain time that you introduce them afterwards, like after a year or two of successful molt, if they're feeding properly or things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question to bring up. And I do quarantine arachnids. If it's captive bred, I don't worry about it so much. And again, majority of everything I have is captive bred. So, but I think the Egyptian imports is a really good example, where over the last couple of years, almost all of the wild caught stuff that I've gotten from Egypt imports have mites for Androcnus bicolor, Androcnus australis, Lyris quinquestriatus. I have some photos I can send you after this is done of kind of an example. And this is a fairly newer thing. These mites are so majority of the time, like with like tarantulas, right? You have like grain mites with tarantulas, but they're not parasitizing the tarantula.
Right.
They're just they get another population and they catch a ride wanting to go somewhere else. It's that way too with tropical scorpions, where it's the same thing with the grain mites. Will kind of hang out on the scorpions, and so it's not it's something you can kind of control or deal with, and you can't ever really kind of get rid of them. But they're not really not harming the scorpion unless they get in huge amounts and exploding a population. So with these mites that are coming in on these Egypt imports on scorpions are parasitized. They're feeding on the scorpions. So they are laying eggs on the scorpions. Those are hatching, and they're kind of in the creases, right, on the sides and the mouth part areas, on the metasomas, kind of in the creases, to where that's where they kind of huddle up, and they're kind of like a small, almost the adults kind of look like an orange like pebble, so it almost can look like sand sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
They also produce in the substrate, which is another problem. So not only are they producing and breeding on the scorpion, but they also go in the substrate. It's an errant species, right? So with tropical species, with some of those mites, you can just dry things out for a while, desiccate stuff, change substrate. For this, there's an element of, they're on the scorpion, and the gestation, generational gestation on them seems to be fairly slow, meaning like maybe a scorpion, for months you don't see anything, and all of a sudden you look in the next day and they're just everywhere on it. So I have, it's something that I'm trying to document, but I haven't quarantined I'm super careful, because obviously I don't want that to spread into my main room. So, I'm trying to be cautious for how I'm, photographing or handling, even like when I take it to look under the microscope, try to make sure that I don't risk anything to bringing that into. But it's interesting to me, and I'm trying to find more time to adequately trying to understand the life cycle of this particular mite, and hopefully maybe at some point too, sending some samples and samples in to get ID'd, find something that's willing to do an ID on it.
Is there a process of treatment or home remedies that you are dabbling with?
Yeah, I've done a couple of things. It's kind of do a substrate change. I've actually will put the scorpion in the refrigerator for like 15 minutes, and kind kind of put it into like almost like a suspension state.
Mhm.
And then taking it and literally just manually removing the mites with like a Q-tip, or not. I want to say a Q-tip because that's pretty short when you're handling something. Even though it's slowed down, you don't want to get your fingers that close. I'll put something on like an extension, almost like a Q-tip on something like tongs or something, and manually remove what I can see. I've also tried to put like Vaseline over what I see as well. But that kind of can cause a little bit of a mess for the scorpions too, because that Vaseline doesn't come off very easily.
Yeah.
So I've tried just little things here and there. You can't really, I mean, what would be ideal is if you could use some CO2 and slow them down, right? So what I do, venom extractions for like true spiders and tarantulas, I use a CO2 chamber to kind of sedate them. Scorpions are really resistant to CO2. So it's really hard to get really anesthetize a scorpion with CO2 very easily. So that's kind of not an option, but kind of cooling them down for a brief period to where they almost look like they're dead. They just kind of like, and then fall over. And it gives you about 10 minutes, 10 minutes of to work with it before it decides to fully come back and be angry self. But so that's something try to do that repetitively, with removing substrate to clean substrate, manually remove the mites. And I do think from that process of doing that like 2 to 3 times, I think I have a population that no longer has those mites, but still, I'll probably still keep an eye on them for another year.
Could you use diatomation for Earth?
I would worry that the scorpion itself would be affected.
Yeah. So I know people have used that for snake mites and stuff.
I would worry with the scorpion itself, because that's going to be a similar effect on them as it would be the mites. Predatory mites potentially might be an option. So I know they use predatory mites for like snakes, or even like some of the tarantulas and things like that. I haven't had a chance to really look into that, but I've had a friend that's done that.
Would the predatory mites require more humidity in arid enclosures? At least that was my thinking about them, because I was in the like the tropical plant hobby, as well as like obviously the reptile hobby and stuff, and you need to keep a certain percentage humidity for them to be able to reproduce properly and thrive.
Yeah, and I don't know if maybe it would be just like a numbers game. Can you put enough in there that's going to survive long enough to just take out what's there, and then they just die off? Again, it's something to keep an eye on, but I do think that there should be probably more concern across the hobby to pay attention, because I think a lot of people probably that's for the kind of medically significant scorpions. Like that is like the source of medically significant scorpions are those Egypt imports with death stalkers and like the Arachnid bicolor and stuff. So it's just something I think the hobby in general just needs to be aware of and keep an eye on.
I definitely agree with that, just because no knock to so like someone of my Facebook friends list was reptile keeper, getting into tarantulas. That's great. Love that. More people getting into inverts. However, he was so like possibly like a 4 to 5 inch Phonopelma, and the person that sold it to him said that it was 2 years old. And in my head, that doesn't add up. And even more so, was it a Phonopelma pelancillo? Pelancillo, and that's already like a very uncommon Phonopelma species. If it was bred, I would have loved to hear about it. I have friends that are like knee deep into Phonopelma that would have heard about it. So that just kind of got me thinking and kind of got me worried. I get it; that happens all the time. Sometimes some people even breeders will accidentally buy, will buy something wholesale, and they're told the wrong information, like this flown pound was 2 years old. When I'm like that female could be well over a decade, and could have just been recently caught from the wild. Granted, it wouldn't. Well, it wouldn't harm anything with his because that's his only tarantula. But at the same time, I'm just wondering. I just wish there was more of a spotlight on this.
Yeah, the mislabeling is really hard because again, like you said, with you know, a lot of the stuff coming in and imports with reptiles, like to no fault of their own, like the people that are getting the stuff that's imported in are just turning around and selling it what it's labeled as, right? And then that pet store is turning around and selling it what it's labeled as. And more often than not, it's wrong. I mean, you know, and I don't know if it's, you know, get back to some of the emperor stuff, to where stuff comes in under a certain name. I don't know if it's, you know, that these collectors in Africa that are, you know, collecting these things are, you know, unknowingly just mislabeling, right? Just grabbing what's there, putting it in, and it's, you know, whatever it's labeled as, it comes across that way. Or if there's some intention in the fact of like, we know that we're collecting these and we can't export this species, but if we call it this, you know, then we can.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a level of like, you know, put a different name on it, and it gets through, you know, gets through Fish and Wildlife. Okay. You know, and so stuff slips in inevitably, because of that. That really, you know, technically should be illegal. And you know, and then again, this gets passed on from, you know, the whatever layers of, you know, import to wholesaler to retailer, or wholesaler to pet store, or whatever else. And those names typically don't change, and you know, the stuff is just mislabeled.
Yeah, I think something like that happened, and I was watching. This was way back when, so I could be wrong, and it could be someone else. But DM Exotics, he was importing wolf snakes, I believe, and that in one of the containers there was actually a crate,
Yeah.
kind of like and kind of like the same kind of thing. And I'm like, I'm glad it he's careful and everything. He's experienced. He knows what he's like looking at, and he was
Yeah.
able to tell that. But I'm sure like if that went to like a pet store or something, some people who are not on the up and up may not have been able to tell the difference, and that could have caused a larger issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, you know, for me too, and again, like I'm not gonna. I do buy a wild caught here and there, and you know, there is occasion where I'll take a chance on something, right? So something comes in, you know, and it'll come in under something, and I'm like, oh, like, you know, maybe I'll spend a few $100s to bring a few in just to see for myself what it is. And if it's not, you know, it is what it is. And if it is, then it's something that's going to be beneficial, you know, for what I'm keeping and what I'm looking to do with it. You know, there's been times, yeah, where I've brought something in and just get like totally burned. We're spending, you know, $600 and it's, you know, it's all just, you know, something that's not what it was supposed to be, or not what was labeled. So that definitely can happen.
It definitely happened with me with Formictopus. There was a seller before, and he was like labeling these some new things, and guess what? They weren't.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you brought up Petrometris earlier, so not saying any names, but there's several importers that just brought in large shipments of Longimanus, and I can almost guarantee that probably a good percentage, if not 25, 30%, whatever it is probably going to be spinifer mixed in there. Now, if someone's looking for spinifer, they might get lucky, but
Yeah.
most of the time, the pet shops and even most of the importers themselves aren't going to take the time to really look at it. A lot of the bugs come in covered in dirt and substrate and whatever else, or covered in dust from shipping, and it makes it even harder to tell sometimes. So
Yeah, stuff comes in, especially Heterometris. That's you know, it can be. I mean, oftentimes it's Salinas, right? Like that's like the go-to. Like if someone's like, "Oh, I got this Asian forest scorpion. What is it?" You know, it's Salinas. Like,
yeah,
you know, and that's just because the mass majority that are imported in the United States are from, you know, certain countries. So yeah, depending if you totally actually know country of origin, it helps out a lot with kind of figuring
Sure.
out possibilities. And even then, you can still have some variations of like, okay, like, you take some really good pictures to potentially tell the difference of some other, differentiate some species. But, that's, people will send me photos all the time and they'll be like, what is this? And the first question I ask is, do you know, if it's wild caught, do you know country of origin? Or even if it's like, if it's captive bred or something, like usually the first question I ask is like, oh, who'd you get it from? Where'd you get it from? And I have enough like reach of knowing people and kind of an idea of like, certain stuff comes in. I can usually kind of an idea of like where it might have came from. Because again, like the number of people that actually have import permits from Fish and Wildlife, right, is a pretty small number that consistently import. So, you tend to sometimes get a lot of people like, oh, like I'm importing this in or I'm bringing this in, and a lot of times it just means like a lot of those people are just buying from somebody who's importing. Versus, right? It's kind of like you're not necessarily the one that's filling out the paperwork and with the import permit in your name and that sort of thing. So it's a fairly small group, and so a lot of times like kind of get an idea of what's around or what's coming in that regard. So,
and on that same note, forgive me if this comes off course. You have a lot of very, very amazing animals on your website and a lot of locality specific stuff. When you're selecting captive bred stuff from overseas or from other private breeders stateside, is there how do I want to say this the wrong way? Is there a way that you personally vet them to make sure that is the correct locality, or do you have associates in your chain of purchasing that say, oh yeah, man, I was there and I was at the importer in Oman and we filled out the documents and here's the photos of us shaking hands? And is that ever a thing, or are we just
yeah, so I guess in that regard, I'm very selective on who I import from.
Right.
So, I oftentimes I import from someone who's very academic, does a lot of taxonomic publications themselves. We have a lot of conversation around taxonomy, right? And, someone that also is very, the ethics of husbandry and keeping is very important to them. So that's, I tend to be I personally do not import wild caught stuff. Yeah. I don't do wild caught imports. Again, I will buy wild caught stuff here and there if I see value in establishing it in my facility. But I don't personally, go to have contacts in other countries to import wild caught stuff. So, yeah, and with the local, the local or not local, but just even keepers in the United States that I may buy some stuff wholesale from. Again, all of them are my friends that we talk and know well, and we also do a lot of like with Dylan Keith, we trade stuff back and forth all the time. Like we're always in communication. Like, oh, like I need this. Do you have this? I'll send him a box with a bunch of mails, and he'll send me a box with them back when he's done with them and with some other stuff. So we're always in conversation about. And there's other people who breed scorpions too on a smaller scale that I consider my friends that we talk quite a bit. And really try to look out for each other in regards to trying to keep a lot of these species going. I don't look at anybody as competition in regards to trying to get customers and take customers, or I'm honestly like, I'm not trying to be the biggest scorpion seller in the United States. That's not a goal of mine. I don't have interest in being that. My big focus is just being successful at what I keep, being able to share that knowledge and be able to offer surplus when I can to the people that want it. And so anytime I have a chance to help out others, I will. So
That's great, man. Thank you.
Yeah.
I do really want to get one of these days, you, Dylan, and a few others just on, like I was thinking about a Scorpion round table kind of discussion kind of thing. I feel like that would be really fun just to have just like a bunch of experienced hobbyists go back and forth talking about various topics, because there's a lot of these things that there's no podcast or information out there publicly. I mean, you have to go out there digging and you'll find it. But I think having bringing more awareness to the Scorpion hobby would be great, even if it gets like even just one person interested. That one person could have such a major effect on the hobby. They could be the next large hobbyist and everything. I think that would be pretty cool down the line.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and reach a different audience, and to kind of talk about these things. And personally, I have intentions on my to-do list to do either a smaller podcast, or even like I thought about doing 5 minutes on a species, like just pick a species and doing just like a short video, put it on like YouTube and social media, just to kind of discuss the basics, right, of care and cool things about them. But for me, it's just a matter of like the time, right? Trying to find the time. I work probably close to 50 to 60 hours a week on kind of like consulting and other business aspects of things, and then I have to spend another how many hours a week with care and maintenance of my collections, and then obviously if I sell stuff, right, I got to pack stuff and try to ship out once a week, and so I have a lot of very early mornings to where I'm up at 4:30, 5 o'clock every morning, trying to get as much done in my day as possible, in order to spend that time with family, where that's much needed. And at the same time, still trying to make sure that I keep everything running along. So
yeah,
it's excellent.
I know we're kind of at witching hour, but something I really wanted to get into, even if it's briefly. So Hans, our buddy in Germany, also he asked about the separate climate rooms and stuff earlier. But the other half of that was he and I both want to know what your experience has been with some form of like a quote unquote communal need until a certain instar. So like I have a brood of isometris that I believe I pulled and separated too early because they just haven't been growing. And I think he noticed a similar thing with Lycus. Have you found that growth rates and things, they seem to do like get a better jump start if you keep them together longer?
Yeah, there's definitely certain species that I think have that benefit. So with the Lycus isometris stuff, I would agree that keeping them together at least for a little while, just kind of dumping in food for them, they tend to do a little better than other species. You will lose some, but I think not as many as if you separate out individually too soon. Even with given an option, right? If you have an enclosure with the gravid, female, she has babies, those babies come off her back. Even with enough space, if they were to want to individually hide by themselves, they have that ability, right? So if that was in their nature to do that, you would think they would just split off. But they do stay grouped in small groups in certain pockets for a decent amount of time. Where I think it's, so it is a fine line. And again, you're dealing with, all right, like you have this number limited if it's a rare species, do you risk that, or do you not? That is a struggle that sometimes, you have to try to make a decision. If you think your chances of getting, the species to keep going and growing without losing too many, to separate them out sooner. But there's times where like I'm like, all right, yeah, they're doing great together, and then they hit a point you're like, oh crap, I just lost half of them because they started to cannibalize. So there's those moments too where you're like, oh, okay, like a molt or two molts, but more than that, then all of a sudden they start picking each other off as they get older. But I do think there's and what's hard for me is like, I would like to tell you like my experience with certain species. But I would say a lot of that right now for me is still anecdotal. I need to I need to be able to repeat it before like giving like solid, like, hey,
we were just
this
curious.
is beneficial, or just, but I would say a lot of the humidity dependent species, even Centroides and Tideus. I mean, for the most part, Tideus tends to be okay communal, and some of them are really, really communal.
Right.
And then Centroides, same thing. Like some can be more communal than others. But I do try to keep the fresh young together at least for a few feedings where I'm just feeding everything, dumping everything and feeding everything. And then, separating kind of as needed, or as stuff's growing a little quicker, maybe I'll separate those ones out or something like that. So
yeah, I put them all back together. So I had them separated, and then after talking to Hans a little bit and stuff about it, and we were thinking maybe there's some sort of chemosensory thing going on with mom, with food availability and things being nearby. Like I don't know. We were tossing a lot of sort of ideas and sort of theories to one another about it. But I put them all back together, and they've actually, I was curious as to if I reintroduced them all together, if I'd have problems, as opposed to keeping them all together the whole time. And they've all seemed to be fine going back together. I haven't noticed any issues or any major signs of cannibalism or anything like that. So we were just curious about your experience with that. If you've seen anything.
Yeah, I think there's value. I mean, especially in the forest scorpions, and if that talk about a topic of misconception. Anytime you have forest scorpion babies, people are like, "Oh, you got to separate them from mom right away, or she'll eat them." And granted, there are times when the mother eats the babies. And I think most of that has to do with that mom kept in suboptimal conditions. There's something environmentally not right in her way to cope with the situation is to, is to consume those calories for her own, right? She's gonna want to save herself more than she is gonna want those babies to live, type of thing. And there's some kind of thing that she's she'll consume those babies in a higher stress or suboptimal situation. And that could be from, disruption too, right? If you just keep bothering them, then something, you trigger it. But I've never had a forest scorpion mother eat her babies. And so it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I know it happens. But, if kept properly, I don't think it's an issue. And sometimes when there's something that's wrong with the brood, the moms will eat babies. So I've seen it where moms have consumed broods when something's just not right with, didn't develop properly, or some weird things happen. They'll consume, the babies. Or if there's a higher number of non-fertilized or underdeveloped, they'll just eat everything. They won't discriminate against what's healthy and what's not. They just know something is wrong. But that being said, for those forest scorpions, they have babies. I keep those babies together with the mom, and at least until, sometimes I'll keep them for a few molts. And I'll sell a few here and there, like surplus. as they're feeding and doing really well. But anything that I have, I keep with mom and just continue to like pre-kill dubia roaches, throw them in there, and she'll take those and help the babies feed off of that material. And then they tend to grow. They tend to grow quicker. I think be more robust and by that method than just separating everything out right away.
Excellent.
It's just the strangest thing because I mean I was feeding them and they were taking fruit flies no problem, but it just seems like they just weren't growing. Like I wasn't getting bits out of them. It was very bizarre. And I wondered if I probably did just pulled them too early. I think is what it was. I should have left them with her a little longer.
Yeah, certain Centroroides species, the same thing. If you separate them out, then you're like, you still have a baby that's 2i that hasn't bolted to 3i for like 6 months.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty much where I'm at with these. So.
Yeah.
And on that same note, something I was going to ask you is I've seen on social media in passing, I don't want to say amateur keepers, but like people that aren't really diehards like us, where they maybe even live in country, and they'll have a 30-gallon fish tank filled with sand and rocks, and there's like 20 Androchnus bicolor in there. And they're keeping these fat tails, Buthidae type scorpions communally. When we were younger, or at least when I was younger, it was like, oh no, you don't keep fat tails together. They'll just kill each other because they're reckless killers, How do you feel about keeping certain species communally just year round?
I can't say that I keep Androchnus bicolor communally year round. I have explored doing communals with them, and
not just them.
Like
I use them as
5 or 6. Yeah, and I've experimented with that species particularly, and I've had a certain level of success given enough space and kind of hides and things like that. So I think if you have a really nice size enclosure, display enclosure, then I don't know about 20 and a 30-gallon, but
yeah,
I definitely think you could keep a decent number together. I know like Parabuthus transvalicus, that those have had success just keeping in a big communal before. Of adults. I keep a lot of my adult Lyris species communally and Hottentota species communally. When I have those adults, now I do like I can tell when one's gravid and pretty close to having babies. I will separate her out from that communal, just because the disruption of the other ones around sometimes will cause the babies will flip off the backs, and then you'll lose some broods from that. So I try to be pretty cautious, but even just in pairs, a lot of the Hottentotta species in pairs have babies with the male and the female, and keep them together all year round. And they'll have broods. Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. Yeah. And I just pairs, I've rarely ever had any issues. Even with some Lyris, that the babies will molt, come off, and even those species, like I will keep them in there with everybody and throw in a bunch of food and feed a couple of times before separating them out as well.
Oh wow.
So yeah, I'm not even one to quickly. I'm never one to like, as soon as they're off of mom's back, really any species, I'm not like gotta separate immediately. I always try to offer food a couple of times to everybody before separating. I don't know if that's right, wrong, or otherwise. It's just what I do. So,
do you notice any communal feeding with mom and broods at all when you're keeping them together like that?
I don't think so for the arid species.
Okay. I'm
trying to think of an example. I don't think anything purposeful from arid species. Definitely the forest scorpion species. We'll see that a lot. Where mom, will sit there, be holding a deviant roach and all the babies are feeding off of it, and she's just, maybe she has one in one hand that she's eating and she's holding the other one, and the babies are feeding off that one. I've seen that a couple of times.
Very cool.
But yeah, otherwise, like, in pretty much what I do is I'll like just pre-kill a couple of larger prey items, throw them right next to mom or dad in the enclosure, and then just dump in a bunch of, kind of 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch crickets, depending on the species and the size of the babies, and just let them go to town.
Oh, gotcha.
And so that being said, what's is interesting is that I can't say I've ever seen a baby preying on another baby in that environment, right? It's like throwing chum in the water and seeing a bunch of sharks, attack the chum. Throw a bunch of baby crickets, and they might both catch the same cricket, but you never really see those babies catching each other in the frenzy of all of that chaos.
Even with mom and dad in there, that's wild.
Yeah,
absolutely wild.
Well, I mean, if you think about it from a biological standpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to where if one species encounters one of its peers, that it immediately kills it and tries to eat it. Like, that doesn't really jive with survival long term.
Oh, sorry. There is an instance with Monocyte Tropus balfouri that when they reach a certain stage, I don't know if there's any scientific backing behind it, because again, they're just spiders kept in boxes. We don't know what they do in the wild. You can base science off what you see in the boxes, concrete, but that once they hit a certain stage, they will kind of fight over prey items. There have been some instances where there'd be some like angry taps from another one, or just like straight up grabbing the food from another one. So it's kind of interesting that with scorpions it's a bit more peaceful than that.
Yeah, they'll still fight over some of the food items.
Okay.
Like they'll both grab onto it and be like kind of a little tug of war. And sometimes they'll be chewing on each side of the cricket as well. But yeah, I don't ever think it like results in like I've not seen a result in them just continuing and killing and eating each other type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very interesting, man. Very, very cool.
Yeah, we're at the 2.5 hour mark. So, is there anything else we wanted to get into, or we?
Yeah, we touch base on a lot, man.
Yeah, I can. I was just excited to have this talk in general, hearing all this information, and definitely gonna be reaching out for part 2 at some point, because there's a lot more things I would like to hit on as well.
Yeah, I was wanting to talk about Obscurus and stuff. So
yeah, definitely. I like if you saw me just like looking at my phone a lot, I was like looking up species name 1, so to make sure I was pronouncing names correctly. 2, because I'm like, oh, I need to add this next time we talk. I need to make sure we hit on this next time we talk. So I do appreciate that, and you will be hearing back from us again.
Yeah, sounds good. I look forward to it. So I appreciate the time. It's been enjoyable. I told you I could talk quite a while. So.
Yeah, definitely.
That was great, man. Thanks so much.
The best way for people to get in touch with you if they have any questions?
Yeah, I would just say through my website, ArachNidRarities.com. There's an email submission. They can reach out through Messenger on my Instagram or social media too, Arachnid Rarities, through Facebook or Instagram. I try to get to messages as soon as I can, but I always try to tell people if they don't hear from me in a couple of days, just send me a reminder, because sometimes I can be guilty of opening a message, but I'll go back to that when I have a second, and then totally space it off. So
Facebook business pages isn't making it any easier, that's for sure.
Yeah. So I do my best.
Get notifications about those, and I won't even know they're there for a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have some specimen on Morph Market as well, right?
Yeah. Morph Market, I just have a few listings here and there. People can reach out to me through that as well. But I don't lean on it too heavily, other than just a platform to try to reach additional people.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate it. This was episode 8 of ArachNerds, part of the Herpeticulture Network, brought to you by Fulvius Apparel and FulviusApparel.com. Use that code THN at checkout. Again, get 15% off your order. It's the exclusive promo code for THN listeners and viewers like you. Flippin' 10 is happening tomorrow, which is Friday the 28th. So catch that live if you're listening to this after the fact. It's also going to be on YouTube and Spotify and all that good stuff. So check that out, and then we'll be back Monday unless there's no major holidays or anything happening Monday, right?
No, we're on, baby.
Okay, cool. So we'll be back for Snakes and Stogies, and then the usual. So thank you, everybody. We will see you later.
See you guys next
All
time.
right, thank you.
Thank you. Nisarg, say it.
Thank you.
Say it. No.
What?
Say bye.
Oh,
We didn't
bye.
get it on Monday.
Come on. give it a goodbye.
Do it Phil Wolf way.
Oh, I can't do it on the spot. See you guys in 2 weeks. I can't.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.